No, this can't be happening. What is this? Help me! I need to get out of here!
The first gunshot tore through the dinner plates before anyone understood what sound they were hearing. Porcelain exploded across the table, red wine splashed against the white walls, and Daniel was already on the floor before the echo finished trembling through the house. His mother's scream did not come all at once. It rose in layers, as if her body needed permission to believe what her eyes were seeing. The second shot never came, but the absence of it felt deliberate, like mercy withheld at the last second. Daniel lay on his side, staring at the underside of the table he had built with his own hands. He could see the screws slightly misaligned where he had rushed the assembly 2 summers ago, and the absurd intimacy of that detail made his chest tighten more than the wound did. He pressed his palm against his abdomen and felt warmth spread between his fingers, sticky and alive. "Don't call anyone yet," he whispered, though he did not know who he was speaking to, and the blood slipping through his knuckles pulsed in disagreement. Across the room, his younger brother Elias stood frozen with the pistol still in his grasp. His hands were shaking so violently that the barrel traced small circles in the air, as if he were trying to erase what had just happened. "You said you wouldn't tell her," Elias said, his voice cracking under the weight of accusation and fear. "You promised me." Daniel tried to answer, but the words collided with the metallic taste filling his mouth, and he wondered if promises dissolved faster than blood when exposed to air. Their mother dropped to her knees between them, her hands hovering uselessly above Daniel's body, afraid to touch him and afraid not to. "What did you do?" she demanded of Elias, though the question carried more disbelief than anger. Elias swallowed hard and lowered the gun an inch, as if obedience could reverse time. "He was going to ruin everything," he said, and the sentence felt rehearsed, polished in private, long before the trigger was pulled. Daniel managed a shallow breath and forced his eyes toward his brother. "I wasn't going to ruin you," he said, each word dragged out like a confession extracted under torture. "I was going to stop you." The difference between those two intentions hovered in the air, fragile and unsustainable, and none of them had the strength to define it properly. Outside, neighbors' dogs began barking, unaware that the house they guarded had already fractured beyond repair. The ambulance lights painted the living room in violent blue and red waves, transforming their family photographs into distorted caricatures of happier years. Paramedics moved with efficient detachment, cutting Daniel's shirt open and pressing gauze into his wound. Elias stood in the corner, his wrists already cuffed, staring at the floor as if he could step back into the moment before the shot if he refused to blink. Their mother kept repeating that it was an accident, though she did not specify which part had been accidental. In the hospital corridor, Daniel drifted in and out of consciousness, his thoughts sliding between present pain and older memories. He remembered teaching Elias to ride a bicycle, running behind him and letting go too soon because he wanted his brother to believe in himself. He remembered the first time Elias lied to him, a small thing about a broken window, and how Daniel had chosen silence over confrontation because he mistook peace for love. Now, lying under fluorescent lights, he wondered whether every small silence had been a rehearsal for this larger betrayal. When he woke fully, the surgery had ended, and the room was quiet, except for the rhythmic beeping of machines. A police officer stood near the door, not aggressive but firm in posture, a guardian of consequences. Daniel's mother sat beside the bed with swollen eyes, clutching his hand as though he might disappear if she loosened her grip. "He didn't mean it," she said, before Daniel could speak, as if defending Elias from a verdict that had not yet been delivered. Daniel turned his head slowly, each movement negotiated with pain. "He meant something," he replied, his voice thin but steady. "Maybe not the bullet, but something." His mother flinched at that, because meaning implied intent, and intent implied a fracture in the image she had protected of her younger son. The officer cleared his throat gently and asked if Daniel felt able to give a statement, and the question felt like a moral trap disguised as procedure. If he told the truth, Elias would face prison, and their mother would spend the rest of her life measuring her love against her failure. If he softened the truth, he would protect his brother, but legitimize the fear that had pulled the trigger. Daniel closed his eyes and imagined Elias in a cell, replaying the shot again and again until guilt calcified into resentment. He also imagined him walking free, convinced that desperation justified violence, and the second image frightened him more. "I need time," Daniel finally said. And the officer nodded, though time was already moving without consent. After the officer left, his mother leaned closer, her voice trembling with urgency. "You know how fragile he is," she whispered. "You know he's not like you." Daniel almost laughed at the absurd compliment buried in that sentence, because strength had never been his defining trait. Endurance had. "Fragile things can still kill," he answered. And her silence confirmed that she understood. Elias sat in a holding room at the station, replaying Daniel's last words before the gun fired. You can't keep borrowing money from people like that. You can't keep lying to them. You're not built for this world. The words had not been cruel, but they had landed like a diagnosis, and Elias had felt exposed in a way that made his skin itch. He had convinced himself that Daniel was about to tell their mother everything about the debts, the threats, the men who had started calling at midnight and breathing into the receiver without speaking. The gun had been in Elias's jacket because he told himself it was protection. He had not planned to use it inside the house, not under the framed photographs of birthdays and graduations. But when Daniel reached for his phone during the argument, Elias's chest tightened with certainty that this was the moment of no return. He had not meant to shoot his brother. He had meant to stop him, and the difference haunted him even before the sirens arrived. When the detective entered the room, Elias tried to hold onto the version of himself that was frightened rather than malicious. He was going to tell her, Elias said, as if that justified anything. The detective listened without interruption, then asked quietly, "Tell her what?" Elias hesitated, because revealing the debts meant exposing the humiliation that had grown in secret over months. "Nothing that mattered," he finally muttered, and the lie felt smaller than the truth but heavier to carry. Back in the hospital, Daniel stared at the ceiling and realized that survival had complicated everything. If he had died, Elias would have been a murderer, and the moral lines would have drawn themselves cleanly. By living, Daniel had become a witness, and witnesses were forced to interpret rather than simply exist. He felt anger rising in him, not explosive but steady, and he feared that anger more than the pain in his abdomen. His mother brought up childhood stories, as if nostalgia could function as anesthesia. She talked about the time Elias got lost in a supermarket and Daniel had found him in the toy aisle, crying but silent. "He's always been scared of losing us," she said, squeezing Daniel's hand. Daniel thought about the irony of that, how fear of loss had manifested as an act that could cause exactly what it sought to prevent. "Maybe he's more scared of being seen," Daniel replied, and she did not argue. 2 days later, the men Elias owed money to called again. Their voices were calm, almost polite, but the undertone was unmistakable. They wanted repayment, and they wanted it soon. Daniel answered the phone because his mother could not stop shaking long enough to speak. "He's in custody," Daniel told them, aware that information was currency in conversations like this. There was a pause on the other end, then a soft laugh that suggested custody was a temporary inconvenience, not a resolution. "You're the older one, right?" the voice asked. Daniel felt the weight of that title settle on his shoulders like a burden he had never agreed to carry. "Then you understand responsibility," the man continued. "Debts don't disappear just because someone panics." Daniel closed his eyes and realized that Elias's bullet had not been the first threat to their family. It had simply been the loudest. When Daniel hung up, he knew that telling the police about the debts would escalate matters beyond his control. If he remained silent, he would inherit a danger that Elias had cultivated in secrecy. He visited Elias in custody the next morning, moving slowly but refusing a wheelchair, because vulnerability felt like weakness in a room full of hardened expressions. Elias looked smaller behind the glass, as though the confines of the holding area had compressed his arrogance into something resembling regret. "I didn't want to hurt you," Elias began immediately, his eyes darting between Daniel's bandaged torso and the guards. Daniel studied his brother's face, searching for sincerity and finding a complex mixture of fear and self-preservation. "You hurt me," Daniel said quietly. "Intent doesn't erase impact." Elias pressed his forehead against the glass, and for a moment Daniel saw the child from the supermarket aisle, overwhelmed and lost. "They're going to kill me if I get out," Elias whispered, and the confession hung heavy between them. Daniel felt a flicker of understanding, followed by anger at being manipulated by it. "You should have told me," Daniel said. "You chose a gun instead of honesty." Elias shook his head, tears forming despite his effort to remain composed. "You always look at me like I'm already failing," he said. "I wanted one thing to be mine." Daniel left the station with more questions than answers. He understood now that Elias's desperation had been real, but so had the violence it produced. If he testified fully, Elias would likely face years in prison, shielded from the men who threatened him, but marked forever by the act against his own brother. If Daniel minimized the event, Elias might be released sooner, but the debts would still loom, and the men would not care about familial forgiveness. Their mother oscillated between pleading for mercy and insisting on justice, her convictions shifting with each phone call from relatives offering unsolicited advice. "We can't lose him," she would say in one breath, and in the next she would whisper, "I raised him better than this." Daniel watched her unravel under the pressure of loving two sons, who now stood on opposite sides of a courtroom. He felt responsible for stabilizing her, even as his own internal equilibrium faltered. The prosecutor visited Daniel in the hospital on the 5th day, outlining the charges with clinical precision. Attempted murder carried a heavy sentence, especially given the proximity and the use of a firearm. Your testimony will be central, she explained, her tone professional but not unkind. Daniel listened and imagined Elias sitting in a cell, replaying the sound of the shot as endlessly as Daniel replayed it in his own mind. What happens if I say it was an accident? Daniel asked. The prosecutor did not answer immediately, which Daniel interpreted as respect rather than evasion. The evidence will still speak, she said eventually, but your words will shape how loudly. Daniel realized that truth in a courtroom was not a fixed entity. It was a volume control, adjusted by those willing to speak. That night, Daniel dreamed of the dinner table before the gunshot, of wine glasses intact and laughter echoing through the house. In the dream, he reached for Elias's hand instead of his phone, and the gesture altered the trajectory of everything. He woke with tears on his face, aware that dreams offered revisions without responsibility. Reality demanded decisions that would scar no matter which direction he chose. Elias, meanwhile, received a visit from one of the men he owed money to, disguised as a concerned acquaintance. The visitor leaned close and spoke softly about loyalty and consequences, about how prison could be either a refuge or a trap, depending on what stories were told. Elias understood the message. If Daniel implicated the debt network, retaliation would not be limited to him. The thought of their mother caught between rival forms of justice made his stomach twist. When Daniel returned home for the first time since the shooting, the house felt smaller, as though walls had absorbed the violence and thickened in response. The repaired section of drywall near the dining room table was slightly lighter than the rest, a visible scar that refused to blend in. Daniel ran his fingers over it and felt an irrational urge to peel it back and expose the damage beneath. His mother watched from the doorway, unsure whether to comfort him or apologize for something she could not name. You don't have to protect him, she said suddenly, surprising both of them. Daniel turned to face her, startled by the shift in her tone. And you don't have to condemn him, he replied. The space between those two statements was narrow but treacherous, and they both knew that navigating it would require more courage than either had demonstrated so far. The court date approached with relentless certainty. Daniel's body healed faster than his trust, and each improvement in his physical condition felt like a countdown to a moral reckoning. He met with his lawyer, who emphasized the long-term implications of minimizing the attack. If he's capable of this once, the lawyer said, what makes you certain he won't be again? Daniel had no satisfying answer, because certainty had abandoned him the moment the first shot shattered porcelain. On the eve of the hearing, Daniel visited Elias one more time. They sat across from each other in silence for a long moment, both aware that whatever was said next would reverberate beyond the room. If I tell the truth, Daniel began, you'll go away for a long time. Elias nodded slowly, his jaw tightening. If I don't, Daniel continued, those men will come after you, and maybe after us. Elias looked up sharply, fear and defiance colliding in his expression. I can handle them, he insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. Daniel leaned forward, ignoring the dull ache in his abdomen. You couldn't handle me, he said, not as an insult but as a reminder. The words lingered between them, heavy with the implication that violence had already proven Elias's limits. For the first time since the shooting, Elias did not argue. He lowered his gaze and whispered, I was scared. Daniel felt the simplicity of that admission cut deeper than any elaborate defense. So was I, Daniel replied. I still am. The fear they shared was not identical, but it overlapped enough to make the decision ahead feel less like a judgment and more like a sacrifice of some version of themselves. As Daniel left the facility, he understood that no choice would restore the family they had been. Protecting Elias from prison might expose them to external danger, while condemning him might protect their bodies at the cost of their bond. The night air felt heavy, pressing against his lungs as if demanding resolution he could not provide. He walked to his car slowly, aware that survival had given him power he did not want, and responsibility he could not escape. He sat behind the wheel for a long time without starting the engine, replaying every conversation, every silence, every moment he might have intervened differently. The gunshot had been sudden, but the path to it had been gradual, paved with pride and secrecy and misplaced protection. Daniel realized that whatever he said in court would not simply determine Elias's fate. It would define his own identity as either a brother who forgave or a man who enforced boundaries. He did not know which role required more strength, only that choosing one would permanently damage the other. The engine finally turned over with a reluctant growl, and Daniel drove home through streets that looked ordinary enough to mock the violence beneath his skin. At a red light, he caught his reflection in the rearview mirror, noticing how the faint bruising under his eyes made him appear older than he felt. He wondered if Elias saw the same reflection when he closed his own eyes at night, or if guilt had already rewritten Daniel's face into something monstrous. The next morning, the courtroom air felt colder than the hospital had, though no one was bleeding here. Elias sat at the defense table in a suit that fit poorly across his shoulders, as if he had borrowed someone else's frame along with someone else's life. Their mother sat between two distant cousins, clutching a handkerchief with such intensity that Daniel feared the fabric might tear. The prosecutor's voice carried calm authority as she described the sequence of events, and Daniel felt the narrative being constructed around them like scaffolding that could not be easily dismantled. When Daniel was called to the stand, his steps sounded too loud against the polished floor. He took the oath and felt the weight of language settle in his mouth, every word suddenly expensive. The prosecutor asked him to describe the argument leading up to the gunshot, and Daniel forced himself to recount the truth without embellishment. He spoke about the debts, about the late-night calls, about his fear that Elias was in deeper trouble than he admitted. Elias's eyes never left him, and that unbroken gaze felt both pleading and accusatory. "Did your brother threaten you before he fired?" the prosecutor asked. Daniel hesitated, because Elias had not issued a formal threat. He had only raised his voice and reached into his jacket. "He said I was going to ruin everything," Daniel answered slowly. "He believed I was about to expose him." The courtroom murmured faintly, as though the collective audience preferred clearer villains. The defense attorney stood and adjusted his glasses, his tone shifting to something softer, almost intimate. "Mr. Hale, you love your brother, correct?" Daniel nodded, aware of the trap embedded in the simplicity of the question. "And you understand that he was under extreme stress at the time?" the attorney continued. Daniel swallowed, feeling his mother's gaze burn into the back of his neck. "I understand he was scared," Daniel replied. "But being scared doesn't make a gun harmless." The judge watched carefully, weighing not only Daniel's words, but the spaces between them. "In your opinion," the defense attorney pressed, "was this a deliberate attempt to kill you?" The question hung in the air like a blade suspended by thread. Daniel considered the memory of Elias's shaking hands, the way the barrel had wavered before the shot. "I don't think he woke up that morning intending to shoot me," Daniel said finally. "But when he pulled the trigger, he knew what a bullet could do." Elias closed his eyes at that, and Daniel felt the fracture widen. The testimony ended without explosion, without revelation dramatic enough to satisfy anyone's appetite for resolution. Yet Daniel sensed that his words had tilted the balance toward consequence rather than absolution. As he stepped down from the stand, his mother's face looked both relieved and devastated, as if she had expected betrayal and mercy simultaneously. Outside the courthouse, reporters lingered despite the case's relative obscurity. One of them asked Daniel whether he believed in forgiveness. He almost laughed at the absurdity of the question, because forgiveness sounded clean and final, while what he felt was messy and ongoing. "I believe in consequences," he said instead, then walked away before they could ask him to clarify. Days later, the verdict arrived. Guilty of aggravated assault with intent to cause serious harm, a charge that carried years, but not decades. The judge cited Elias's lack of prior violent offenses and Daniel's measured testimony as factors in determining the sentence. Elias would serve 7 years, eligible for parole after 5, with mandated counseling and restitution. Their mother collapsed into tears at the sound of the number, as if it were a physical object dropped onto her chest. Elias did not cry when the sentence was read. He looked at Daniel with a complicated expression that contained gratitude, resentment, and something like shame. Daniel nodded once, unsure what message he intended to convey. Perhaps it was simply acknowledgement that the decision had been made and could not be revised. The debt collectors did not wait for the dust to settle. 2 nights after the sentencing, Daniel returned home to find the front door slightly ajar. His pulse accelerated as he stepped inside, scanning for signs of intrusion. The living room was intact, but the dining table bore a new mark carved into the wood, a shallow line that traced the shape of a single word: owed. His mother stood in the kitchen, pale and silent, clutching a note that had been left on the counter. "They said prison doesn't erase what he owes," she whispered. Daniel read the message quickly, his jaw tightening. The men had made it clear that Elias's absence did not absolve the family, and that Daniel, as the older brother, was now expected to demonstrate responsibility. Daniel felt anger surge again, but this time it was directed outward rather than inward. He called the detective who had initially handled the shooting, explaining the new threat. The detective listened carefully, then warned Daniel that pursuing the debt network would be dangerous and prolonged. "If you testify against them," the detective said, "you're escalating from a family tragedy to organized crime." Daniel understood the implication. He could remain silent, pay off the debt through years of sacrifice, and hope the men kept their word. Or he could cooperate with law enforcement, risking retaliation that would place his mother directly in harm's way. No choice felt protective. Each simply shifted the target. When Daniel visited Elias in prison for the first time, the environment felt harsher than the holding room had. The clang of metal doors echoed through the corridors, and the air carried a faint smell of institutional detergent that failed to mask underlying decay. Elias approached the visitation area with guarded steps, his expression hardened by the short time he had already spent inside. "They went to the house, didn't they?" Elias asked without greeting. Daniel did not pretend ignorance. "They carved the table," he replied. "Left a message." Elias pressed his lips together, guilt flickering across his features. "I thought if I handled it myself, you'd never have to know," he muttered. Daniel almost snapped at the irony but restrained himself. "You handled it with a gun," Daniel said evenly, "and now I'm handling it with lawyers and police." Elias leaned closer, lowering his voice. "If you cooperate with them," he warned, meaning the authorities, "those men won't care that I'm in here. They'll hurt you. They'll hurt her." Daniel felt the weight of that prediction settle heavily. "So, what do you suggest?" Daniel asked. Elias hesitated, then said, "Pay it." Slowly, quietly. Daniel stared at his brother, trying to determine whether this was concern or cowardice. "And when they come back for more?" Daniel pressed. Elias had no answer that satisfied even himself. Weeks passed in a tense equilibrium. Daniel worked longer hours, diverting most of his income toward the debt in small, humiliating installments. Each payment felt like an admission that violence had succeeded in shaping his life. His mother tried to contribute from her modest savings, but Daniel refused, unwilling to let her bear the financial consequence of Elias's choices. At night, Daniel lay awake, replaying the courtroom scene, wondering whether a harsher testimony might have protected them better. If Elias had received a longer sentence, perhaps the debt collectors would have shifted their focus entirely. Yet the idea of deliberately increasing his brother's punishment to solve an external problem felt morally corrosive. One evening, as Daniel left work, he noticed a car idling across the street. The driver did not attempt subtlety. He simply watched. Daniel approached cautiously, his heart steady despite the adrenaline rising in his veins. The window rolled down, revealing a familiar face from the late-night calls. "You're making progress," the man said conversationally. "But progress isn't the same as completion." Daniel met his gaze without flinching. "I'm paying what he owes," he replied. The man smiled faintly. "He owed more than money," he said. "He owed trust." The implication unsettled Daniel more than any explicit threat. Trust suggested betrayal within the network, obligations beyond financial transactions. "He didn't betray you," Daniel insisted, though he was no longer certain. The man shrugged. "Everyone betrays someone eventually," he replied, then drove away. Daniel returned home shaken. Realizing that the debt might not be purely monetary, he arranged another meeting with the detective, sharing his suspicion that Elias's involvement extended deeper than gambling losses. The detective listened carefully and mentioned ongoing investigations into loan sharking operations that often coerced participants into additional illegal activities. "If your brother was pressured into something," the detective said, "that changes the scope." Daniel visited Elias again, this time with sharper questions. "What else did you promise them?" he demanded, as soon as they sat down. Elias's eyes flickered defensively. "Nothing," he said too quickly. Daniel leaned forward, lowering his voice. "They said you owed trust," he insisted. "That's not about money." Elias's composure cracked slightly. He looked away, jaw tightening. "They wanted me to deliver something," he admitted finally. "Just once. I thought I could do it and be done." Daniel felt a chill run through him. "Deliver what?" he asked. Elias hesitated, then whispered, "Information." Daniel's mind raced. "About who?" he pressed. Elias swallowed. "About you," he said, barely audible. The words landed with more force than the bullet ever had. Daniel sat back slowly, absorbing the revelation. "They thought you were too clean," Elias continued, eyes fixed on the table. "Too careful. They wanted leverage." Daniel felt a mixture of rage and disbelief. "So, you agreed to hand them information about me?" he asked, his voice steady only through effort. Elias shook his head vigorously. "I never gave them anything," he insisted. "I couldn't." Daniel studied his brother's face, searching for evidence of deception. "But you considered it," he said quietly. Elias did not deny it. The silence between them grew thick, layered with unspoken accusations and regrets. "That's why you panicked when I reached for my phone," Daniel realized aloud. "You thought I was going to expose you, and then you'd have nothing to trade." Elias's shoulders sagged, the fight draining from him. "I thought if you told her," he said, "they'd come after you anyway. I thought I could scare you into staying quiet. You shot me, Daniel replied, the understatement cutting through the air. Elias closed his eyes, as if the memory replayed on the inside of his eyelids. I didn't mean to hit you, he murmured, and the inadequacy of the statement was evident even to him. Daniel left the prison with a new understanding that complicated his anger. Elias had not only feared exposure, he had been entangled in a web that demanded sacrifice. By refusing to betray Daniel fully, Elias had endangered himself within the network. The gunshot, then, was not solely an act of selfish desperation. It was also the eruption of a conflict Elias had been losing quietly. The detective confirmed that the loan sharking ring had been seeking leverage over individuals with stable reputations to expand their operations. Daniel's clean record and professional connections made him a valuable target. If your brother resisted, the detective said, that might explain their continued pressure. Daniel faced another decision: cooperate fully with the investigation, potentially dismantling the network, but placing his family in immediate danger, or continue paying and hope the threat diminished over time. He discussed the option with his mother, who looked older each day. The situation persisted. I can't lose you too, she said, her voice raw. Daniel realized that her fear now extended beyond prison walls. At work, Daniel found it increasingly difficult to concentrate. Colleagues noticed his distraction but respected his silence. He considered requesting relocation or temporary leave, but that would signal vulnerability to those watching. Instead, he maintained routine, using predictability as a shield. One night, as he returned home, he found the house dark despite his mother's habit of leaving lights on. His pulse quickened as he stepped inside cautiously. The living room was undisturbed, but a window in the kitchen stood open. On the counter lay a small envelope containing a photograph of Daniel leaving the courthouse, circled in red ink. The message was clear: cooperation would not go unnoticed. Daniel felt a surge of protective fury that eclipsed his earlier hesitation. He called the detective immediately and agreed to provide full testimony against the network, including Elias's account of the attempted coercion. The decision felt like stepping onto a narrow bridge over a deep chasm, aware that retreat was no longer possible. When Daniel informed Elias of his choice, the reaction was explosive. You're going to get her killed, Elias accused, gripping the edge of the table until his knuckles whitened. Daniel met his gaze steadily. If I keep paying them, he replied, they'll never stop. You know that. Elias shook his head violently. You think prison walls protect me? He demanded. They have reach. Daniel felt the familiar weight of guilt pressing against his ribs. You asked me to pay quietly, he said. That was your solution. Elias's voice cracked. Because I already destroyed enough, he whispered. The admission lingered, heavy and incomplete. The investigation moved quickly once Daniel committed. Undercover operations intensified, and several members of the network were arrested in coordinated raids. News reports framed the crackdown as a victory against organized crime, but Daniel knew that victory was provisional. Retaliation often followed exposure. 2 weeks after the arrests, Daniel received a call from the prison. Elias had been assaulted in the yard, not fatally, but severely enough to require hospitalization. Daniel rushed to the facility's infirmary, where Elias lay with a fractured cheekbone and bruised ribs. The guards claimed the altercation was random, but Daniel recognized the message beneath the surface. You see? Elias rasped when Daniel approached. You escalated it. Daniel felt a wave of guilt so intense it nearly doubled him over. If I hadn't, he replied quietly, they would still be outside our house. Elias turned his head away, unwilling or unable to concede. Their mother sat beside the infirmary bed, her hands trembling as she adjusted the blanket. When does it end? She asked, no one in particular. Daniel had no answer that offered comfort. The consequences were now distributed unevenly. Elias bore physical retaliation inside prison, while Daniel lived under constant vigilance outside. As Daniel left the facility that evening, he realized that his choices had not eliminated danger, but merely redistributed it. Saving his mother from immediate threats had exposed Elias to internal violence. Protecting Elias from a harsher sentence had extended the network's leverage long enough to entangle Daniel further. Each attempt to shield one had wounded the other. He stood in the parking lot under a dim streetlight, feeling the enormity of the situation press against him. The gunshot that began this chain had been a single, irreversible moment, yet its consequences continued to multiply in directions he could not predict. Daniel understood now that strength was not a fixed trait but a series of decisions made under pressure, each carving away a portion of the self. He drove home in silence, aware that the story was far from resolution. The arrests would lead to trials, testimonies, and possibly more revelations about Elias's involvement. Elias would heal physically, but carry the psychological burden of knowing that his brother's cooperation had triggered his assault. Their mother would continue balancing love and fear without relief. Daniel parked in front of the house and stared at the repaired section of wall visible through the window. The scar remained lighter than the rest, a reminder that damage could be covered but not erased. He stepped inside and locked the door behind him, understanding that survival had become a daily negotiation rather than a single victory. The consequences of the shot were still unfolding, and every attempt to contain them seemed only to widen the circle of impact. Daniel began to notice how even small sounds made him tense, how the creak of the floorboards at night felt like a prelude to intrusion. He installed cameras around the house, not because the detective insisted, but because the illusion of control was the only thing keeping his thoughts from spiraling. His mother tried to pretend the devices were temporary, yet she memorized the monitor angles as if studying for an exam she never wanted to take. The trial against the loan sharking ring moved forward with methodical inevitability. Daniel was called again, this time not as a victim of familial violence, but as a witness against organized coercion. The courtroom felt different now, larger and more impersonal, as though his family's tragedy had been absorbed into a broader narrative of crime statistics and legal strategy. He described the carved word on the table, the envelope with his photograph, the man in the idling car, each detail layering onto the record like sediment. Defense attorneys attempted to undermine his credibility by highlighting his emotional involvement. "Isn't it true?" one asked, "that your cooperation was motivated by anger toward your brother?" Daniel felt the implication burn. "My cooperation was motivated by the fact that they threatened my family," he replied evenly. The attorney pressed further, suggesting that Daniel might be exaggerating threats to justify his earlier testimony against Elias. Daniel realized that in this courtroom, he was both accuser and compromised witness. His life had become evidence, dissected and reframed to serve narratives he did not control. "I didn't want any of this," he said finally, his voice steadier than he felt. "But wanting doesn't erase what happened." Meanwhile, Elias's position inside prison grew more precarious. Word spread quickly that he had connections to an external investigation, and some inmates viewed him as a liability. During a visit, he kept glancing over his shoulder, his previous bravado replaced by a hypervigilance Daniel recognized from his own nights at home. "They think I'm talking," Elias muttered. "Even if I'm not." Daniel studied his brother's bruised face, noticing the subtle flinch when footsteps echoed too close. "I didn't tell them you gave details beyond what was necessary," Daniel said. Elias laughed bitterly. "Necessary is a flexible word," he replied. The accusation hung between them, unspoken but potent. Their mother tried to maintain routine, cooking meals for 2 instead of 3, leaving Elias's room untouched. Daniel caught her standing in the doorway once, staring at the unmade bed as though it might offer answers. "He was never built for cages," she whispered. Daniel almost responded that none of them were, but he swallowed the thought, recognizing that statements of universality did not comfort specific suffering. As the trial against the ring progressed, more information surfaced about the network's operations. They had coerced small business owners, exploited addicts, and leveraged family secrets to maintain control. Daniel listened to testimonies from strangers whose lives had been quietly dismantled over months or years. He began to see Elias not as uniquely reckless, but as one of many drawn into a system that fed on vulnerability. Yet that understanding did not absolve the gunshot. Compassion for Elias's entanglement did not erase the memory of porcelain exploding across the dinner table. Daniel felt himself caught between empathy and resentment, neither emotion strong enough to eclipse the other. He resented that Elias's fear had manifested as violence against him rather than confession. One afternoon, Daniel received an unexpected call from the prison warden requesting a meeting. The warden explained that Elias had been involved in another altercation, this time as an aggressor rather than a victim. He initiated the confrontation, the warden said, sliding a report across the desk. Daniel scanned the document, noting that Elias had struck another inmate who allegedly threatened to harm their mother upon release. Daniel felt a surge of conflicting emotions, pride that Elias defended their mother, frustration that he had escalated his own danger. "He's adapting poorly," the warden concluded. If this continues, his parole eligibility could be affected. The implication was clear. Elias's behavior inside would shape his future outside. When Daniel confronted Elias during the next visit, his tone was sharper than before. "You can't fight every threat," he said. Elias's eyes flashed with something between defiance and despair. "You think I should just wait?" he shot back. "Wait for someone to decide she's a soft target?" Daniel leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Every time you react, you give them exactly what they want," he insisted. "Chaos." Elias's jaw tightened. "You think your calm makes you superior," he said. but your calm didn't stop me from pulling the trigger." The statement struck deeper than Elias intended. Daniel felt his composure crack slightly. "No," he admitted. "It didn't." That night, Daniel replayed the argument in his mind, recognizing that Elias's resentment toward him predated the debts. It had grown in the shadow of comparison, in the constant reinforcement that Daniel was steady, while Elias was fragile. The gunshot had not only been about fear of exposure, it had been an eruption of long-suppressed inadequacy. Weeks later, the trial concluded with multiple convictions. Several key figures in the ring received substantial sentences, though not enough to dismantle the entire network. The media coverage faded quickly, replaced by newer scandals. For Daniel, however, the consequences remained intimate and ongoing. Shortly after the verdict, a fire broke out in a storage unit Daniel rented for his contracting business. Investigators ruled it suspicious, but inconclusive. Daniel stood in front of the charred remains of equipment he could barely afford to replace, and felt the weight of retaliation settle fully onto his shoulders. The message was subtle but unmistakable. Cooperation carried a cost. Insurance would cover part of the loss, but delays meant weeks without steady income. Daniel considered selling the house to ease financial pressure, yet the idea felt like surrendering another piece of stability. When he mentioned the possibility to his mother, she shook her head firmly. "If we leave, they win," she said, her voice thin but resolute. Elias learned of the fire through a delayed letter and reacted with visible distress during their next visit. "I told you," he said, guilt saturating his tone. "I told you they'd find a way." Daniel resisted the urge to lash out. "And if I hadn't cooperated?" he asked quietly. "Would they have forgiven you for refusing to hand me over?" Elias had no response that didn't implicate himself. The silence between them felt different now, less accusatory and more resigned. They were both living with the knowledge that every path forward involved sacrifice. Months passed, marked by incremental adjustments rather than dramatic shifts. Daniel rebuilt his business slowly, taking smaller projects while saving aggressively. He slept lightly, waking at every unfamiliar sound. His mother began attending counseling sessions recommended by the detective's office, confronting the reality that her family's fractures required more than quiet endurance. Elias, meanwhile, entered mandatory therapy inside prison. During one visit, he described a session in which he was asked to articulate the precise moment he decided to pull the trigger. "I can't find it," he admitted. "It's like the decision happened before I knew I'd made it." Daniel listened carefully, recognizing the complexity in that statement. "Maybe it wasn't one moment," Daniel suggested. "Maybe it was a series of smaller ones." Elias nodded slowly, absorbing the idea. "Every time I didn't tell you something," he said. "Every time I chose them over you." The acknowledgement did not repair anything, but it shifted the tone from defensiveness to reflection. One evening, Daniel returned home to find his mother sitting at the dining table, tracing the carved word with her fingertip. The scar in the wood had darkened slightly over time, blending into the grain yet remaining visible. "I keep thinking if we sand it down," she said softly, "it will disappear." Daniel pulled out a chair and sat beside her. "We could replace the table," he offered. She shook her head. "Then it's like it never happened," she replied. Daniel understood that erasure was not healing. The table, like his scar, was a reminder of consequence rather than an invitation to forget. "Maybe we leave it," he said, "so we remember what silence costs." A year after the shooting, Elias became eligible for a review of his parole status. His disciplinary record complicated the process, but his participation in therapy and educational programs weighed in his favor. Daniel attended the hearing, aware that his presence would influence perception. When asked about his relationship with Elias, Daniel chose his words carefully. "He made a decision that hurt me," he said, "and I made decisions that hurt him." The panel listened intently. "But I believe he understands now that fear isn't an excuse," Daniel continued, "and that strength isn't about control." Elias watched him with an expression Daniel struggled to interpret. It contained gratitude, but also the lingering tension of knowing that his freedom still depended partly on the brother he had shot. The panel deferred their decision, requesting additional evaluations before granting release. Outside the facility, Daniel felt the familiar weight of uncertainty settle in. If Elias were released early, he would face a world still adjusting to the fallout of his actions. If he remained incarcerated, resentment might calcify further. On the drive home, Daniel's phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. The text contained only a single sentence. "Not all debts are visible." Daniel stared at the screen, recognizing the subtle persistence of the network's remnants. Though major figures were imprisoned, smaller factions remained active, adapting. He did not show the message to his mother immediately. Instead, he forwarded it to the detective, who assured him they would trace the number. The reassurance felt procedural rather than protective. Daniel realized that the threat might never disappear entirely. It would simply evolve. That night, he visited Elias again, choosing not to mention the message. They spoke about mundane topics, books Elias was reading, classes he had enrolled in. The normalcy felt fragile but necessary. "Do you ever think about that night?" Elias asked suddenly. Daniel hesitated, then nodded. "Every day," he admitted. "I don't remember your face when it happened," Elias confessed. "Just the sound." Daniel considered that. "I remember your hands," he replied. They were shaking. Elias closed his eyes briefly. "I wish they had been steady," he said. And the statement carried both regret and a disturbing undercurrent of what might have been. Daniel felt a chill at that nuance. "Steady hands don't make right decisions," he said firmly. Elias looked at him, absorbing the correction. The exchange revealed that even in remorse, dangerous thoughts lingered. As the second year approached, the parole board granted Elias conditional release under strict supervision. The decision felt like another pivot point, heavy with risk. Daniel helped prepare the house for his brother's return, installing additional locks not because he distrusted Elias, but because he distrusted the world Elias would re-enter. When Elias walked through the front door for the first time since the shooting, the air felt charged. He paused at the sight of the dining table, his gaze lingering on the carved word. "You kept it," he said quietly. Daniel nodded. "We don't pretend," he replied. Their mother embraced Elias with a mixture of relief and caution, as though hugging something fragile and volatile at once. That evening, they sat together in uneasy silence, aware that proximity did not equate to restoration. Every glance carried history. Every pause carried implication. In the weeks that followed, Elias struggled to adjust. Job applications were rejected politely but consistently. Neighbors offered strained smiles but avoided conversation. Daniel tried to help without dominating, conscious of the imbalance that had long defined their relationship. One night, Daniel awoke to the sound of Elias pacing in the living room. He stepped out quietly and found his brother staring at the security monitor. "I can't stop thinking they're still out there," Elias said without turning. Daniel joined him, studying the empty street displayed on the screen. "They might be," he acknowledged. Elias exhaled slowly. "If something happens again," he said, "I won't hesitate." Daniel felt the tension in that statement. "Hesitation isn't weakness," he replied. "It's space to choose." Elias glanced at him, uncertainty flickering across his face. The circle of impact had not closed. It had merely expanded to include new layers of fear and fragile hope. Daniel understood that forgiveness was not a singular act but a series of restrained reactions, each one preventing escalation by inches. Yet restraint demanded constant vigilance, and vigilance was exhausting. As he returned to bed, Daniel realized that the gunshot continued to echo, not as sound but as consequence shaping every decision. The house stood intact, the table scarred, the family together but altered. Outside, unseen forces recalibrated in response to past defeats. Inside, trust rebuilt itself slowly. Aware that it could fracture again under pressure, Daniel closed his eyes, knowing that the story remained unfinished, its resolution deferred by the complexity of choices that refused to simplify. The consequences were still unfolding, and each day required negotiation between protection and freedom, between memory and possibility. He did not know where the next fracture would appear, only that it would demand another decision with no clean outcome. The days after Elias's return settled into a tense rhythm that felt almost normal until examined too closely. Daniel found himself measuring silence differently, trying to determine whether Elias's quiet meant reflection or suppression. Every shared meal carried an undercurrent of evaluation, as though they were both waiting for the other to misstep. Elias secured a part-time job at a warehouse on the edge of town, work that required more physical endurance than conversation. Daniel admired the effort but worried about the isolation. Long hours in a cavernous building left too much space for intrusive thoughts. One evening, Elias returned home later than usual, his shirt stained with something darker than grease. Daniel's chest tightened as he stepped forward. "What happened?" he asked. Elias wiped his hands on a rag, avoiding eye contact. "Nothing," he replied, too quickly. Daniel's voice hardened slightly. "You don't get to say nothing anymore." Elias exhaled sharply. "A guy there recognized me," he admitted. "Started talking about prison like it was a joke." Daniel studied the bruise forming near his brother's temple. "And you responded?" he asked carefully. "I walked away," Elias said, the words edged with frustration. Daniel searched his face for contradiction, but found only simmering anger contained by visible effort. "Walking away isn't surrender," Daniel said quietly. Elias shot him a look. "You've been practicing that speech," he muttered. Daniel did not deny it. Repetition had become his shield against escalation. Weeks passed without overt incident, but the subtle pressures remained. Daniel continued to receive occasional anonymous messages, each one vague enough to avoid explicit threat, yet pointed enough to sustain unease. The detective traced some to prepaid devices with no meaningful leads. "They're testing you," the detective said during one meeting, "waiting to see if you crack." Daniel felt the irony in that observation. He had not cracked when his brother shot him, nor when the debt collectors carved their message into the table, nor when Elias was beaten inside prison. Yet he felt fissures forming in less visible ways. In the way he avoided eye contact with strangers, in the way he flinched at raised voices in public. Resilience did not equate to invulnerability. It simply meant the fractures were internal. One Sunday afternoon, as the three of them sat in the living room, the doorbell rang unexpectedly. Daniel froze for a fraction of a second before rising. Elias stood as well, instinctively positioning himself between their mother and the door. Daniel noticed the movement and felt a surge of conflicting emotions. Gratitude and resentment braided tightly together. When he opened the door, a man in a plain jacket stood on the porch, expression neutral. "I'm not here to cause trouble," the man said calmly. "I just want to talk." Daniel recognized him as one of the lower-level operatives from the dismantled network, someone who had avoided major charges due to lack of evidence. "There's nothing to discuss," Daniel replied evenly. The man's gaze flicked briefly past Daniel, likely assessing who was inside. "You think you ended something," he said quietly. "You only shifted it." Daniel felt Elias's presence behind him, tense and coiled. "If you're threatening us," Daniel said, keeping his voice steady, "I'll call the police." The man shook his head. "No threats," he replied. "Just information. Some of the people you helped put away had partners who don't like unfinished business." Daniel understood that this was not an empty warning, but neither was it actionable. "If you're worried about unfinished business," Daniel said, "tell them to stop texting me." The man almost smiled. "You assume the messages are connected," he said. "You're more central than you think." The statement unsettled Daniel more than any direct threat. Elias stepped forward then, his restraint visibly strained. "Say what you came to say," he demanded. The man's eyes narrowed slightly. "You were supposed to deliver something," he reminded Elias. "You didn't. That debt doesn't vanish." Daniel's stomach tightened. He had believed that exposing the ring had reset the ledger. Apparently, personal obligations lingered beyond institutional collapse. "What do you want?" Daniel asked, cutting through the tension. The man shrugged lightly. "Not money," he said. "Information." Daniel felt the old pattern attempting to reassert itself. "About me?" he asked. The man's gaze held his. "About someone else," he replied. Elias stiffened. "No," he said immediately. Daniel turned slightly, catching the tremor in his brother's voice. "Who?" Daniel pressed. The man hesitated, weighing how much to reveal. "A prosecutor," he said finally. "Someone involved in the trial." Daniel felt the implications cascade rapidly. "You want us to spy on someone who put your associates in prison," Daniel said, incredulous. The man's expression remained calm. "We want leverage," he corrected. "It doesn't have to be dramatic, just access, schedules, patterns." Elias's breathing quickened audibly. Daniel realized that the network, fractured though it was, still sought expansion through coercion. "If we refuse?" Daniel asked. The man's eyes flickered briefly toward the house. "Then you continue living like this," he said, waiting. The ambiguity in that word was deliberate. Daniel closed the door without further comment, heart pounding. Elias paced immediately, fists clenched. "We can't do this again," he said, voice raw. Daniel nodded slowly. "We won't," he replied, though the certainty felt thin. Their mother watched from the couch. Fear etched deeply into her features. "You see?" Elias said, turning on Daniel. "It never ends." Daniel met his gaze. "It ends when we stop reacting the way they expect," he said. Elias laughed bitterly. "And what do they expect?" Daniel considered that. "Fear," he answered. "Isolation." That night, Daniel contacted the detective again, recounting the visit in detail. The detective listened carefully and explained that targeting a prosecutor would escalate federal involvement. "If they're serious," he said, "this is bigger than your family." Daniel felt a strange mixture of dread and grim validation. The following week, surveillance increased around their home discreetly. Unmarked vehicles parked intermittently down the street, and Daniel was briefed on protocols for documenting suspicious activity. Elias oscillated between relief and agitation, uncomfortable with being both protected and monitored. One evening, Elias confronted Daniel in the kitchen. "You think involving them makes us safer," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the window. "But it just paints a bigger target." Daniel set down his glass deliberately. You wanted me to hesitate, he said. Hesitation gave them room. Elias's jaw tightened. And decisiveness got me assaulted, he countered. Daniel did not dismiss the point. Every choice costs, he said quietly. But doing nothing is also a choice. Elias's shoulders sagged slightly, the fight draining into exhaustion. I'm tired of being the problem, he muttered. Daniel felt that statement reverberate painfully. You're not the only problem, Daniel replied. You were just the loudest one. Elias looked up sharply, surprised by the admission. Daniel continued. I've been controlling since we were kids. I decided what was safe, what was smart. Maybe I never left you space to fail without it feeling catastrophic. Elias absorbed that slowly. You think this is about space? He asked skeptically. Daniel hesitated. Partly, he said. When you felt cornered, you chose force. That doesn't excuse it, but it explains something. The conversation did not resolve anything, but it shifted the blame from singular to shared without diluting responsibility. Elias did not apologize again. He seemed to recognize that repeated apologies without structural change were hollow. A month later, the prosecutor whose name had been mentioned requested a meeting with Daniel. She had been informed of the attempted approach and wanted to assess the risk personally. Sitting across from her in a secure office, Daniel felt the layers of entanglement tighten. They think you have access to my schedule, she said bluntly. Daniel nodded. They approached us, he confirmed. We refused. She studied him carefully. Refusal is rarely the end, she said. Daniel understood that better than anyone. The prosecutor outlined additional measures being taken to protect her team. You've become part of this, whether you intended to or not, she said. Daniel felt the weight of that inclusion. His initial choice to testify had expanded into a role he never sought. Meanwhile, tension at home intensified subtly. Elias began sleeping less, pacing at night, much like Daniel once had. One early morning, Daniel found him sitting at the dining table, staring at the carved word. I keep thinking if I had just told you everything, Elias said, without looking up. None of this would have happened. Daniel pulled out a chair and sat opposite him. If you had told me everything, he replied slowly, we would have fought. I might have still gone to the police. They might have targeted us sooner. Elias looked up then. So you're saying it was inevitable? He asked. I'm saying we don't get to rewrite it cleanly, Daniel answered. Every version has a cost. Elias exhaled, shoulders slumping. That afternoon, as Daniel left work, he noticed the same idling car from months ago. This time, however, he did not approach. Instead, he documented the license plate and called it in. The driver sped away before officers arrived. Daniel felt both empowered and unsettled. Vigilance had become reflex. 2 days later, the house was vandalized. Windows shattered overnight, and spray-painted across the front door were 3 words. Balance must return. The message was ambiguous, yet ominous. Their mother stood trembling on the porch as police documented the scene. Elias clenched his fists at his sides. They want a reaction, Daniel said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. Elias's voice was tight. Maybe they want something else. Daniel turned to him. Like what? He asked. Elias hesitated. Maybe they want me, he said finally. The implication hung heavy. Daniel's mind raced. You're not going anywhere, he said firmly. Elias's gaze did not waver. Maybe I should, he replied. If I draw them away, Daniel cut him off sharply. You don't get to martyr yourself, he said. That's just another form of control. Elias flinched at the accusation. You think I'm trying to control this? Elias demanded. Daniel held his gaze. You always are, he said quietly. Even when you think you're sacrificing. The police increased patrols temporarily, but Daniel sensed that external protection had limits. The phrase balance must return echoed in his thoughts. What balance? Between testimony and retaliation? Between prison and freedom? Between brother and brother? A week later, Elias received a call on his prepaid phone from an unknown number. Daniel overheard fragments of the conversation. A meeting proposed, assurances of safety, hints at closure. When Elias ended the call, his expression was unreadable. They want to talk, Elias said. Daniel's chest tightened. About what? He asked. Elias's jaw set. About finishing what I started, he replied. Daniel felt the familiar pressure of a looming decision. You're not going alone, he said immediately. Elias shook his head. They said only me. Daniel's voice hardened. That's how it begins. Elias paced, agitation radiating from him. You think they'll stop if we keep calling the police? He asked. Daniel hesitated, aware of the thinness of that strategy. No, he admitted. But I don't trust a private conversation. Elias's eyes flashed. "You never trust me to handle anything," he said. Daniel inhaled slowly. "Because the last time you handled something alone, you shot me," he replied, the truth blunt and unembellished. The words hung between them, raw and undeniable. Elias's shoulders sagged as the memory resurfaced with full force. "I know," he whispered. Daniel softened slightly, but did not retract the statement. They agreed reluctantly to inform the detective about the proposed meeting. Surveillance was arranged discreetly at the suggested location, an abandoned warehouse near the outskirts of town. Daniel insisted on being nearby, despite instructions to remain distant. The night of the meeting, tension saturated the air. Elias walked toward the warehouse alone, a wire hidden beneath his jacket. Daniel watched from a concealed vantage point, heart pounding with restrained panic. Police units were positioned strategically, waiting for a signal. Inside, Elias was greeted by two men Daniel recognized only vaguely from prior encounters. Their conversation was tense but measured. "You broke the chain," one of them said. "Balance requires restoration." Elias swallowed, keeping his voice steady. "I won't do what you're asking," he said. The men exchanged glances. "Then you'll pay differently," the other replied. Elias felt the weight of the threat but remained standing. "I've already paid," he said quietly. 7 years. Outside, Daniel strained to hear through the transmitted audio. The detective's hand hovered near the signal trigger. When one of the men stepped closer to Elias, voice lowering ominously, the command was given. Officers stormed the warehouse, weapons drawn, ordering everyone to the ground. Chaos erupted briefly, but no shots were fired. The men were apprehended, their attempted coercion recorded clearly. Elias was escorted out under protective custody, his face pale but composed. As Daniel approached him afterward, relief collided with dread. "You were ready to go through with it alone," Daniel said, voice tight. Elias met his gaze. "I was ready to end it," he replied. Daniel understood that "end it" could mean different things. End the threats. Comes Nader. End the cycle. Perhaps even end himself if necessary. The realization unsettled him deeply. "You don't get to decide when it ends," Daniel said quietly. Elias's eyes flickered with something fragile. Back home, exhaustion settled heavily over all three of them. The arrests would likely trigger further legal proceedings, perhaps finally severing the network's residual influence. Yet Daniel knew that resolution in court did not equate to psychological closure. As he lay awake that night, he replayed the image of Elias standing alone in the warehouse, refusing the offer. The refusal mattered, but so did the impulse to shoulder everything alone. The gunshot had been an explosion of fear. This meeting had been an exercise in restraint. Daniel stared at the ceiling, aware that the circle of impact had expanded yet again. They had prevented immediate harm, but new consequences would ripple outward. More testimony, more exposure, more public scrutiny. Balance had not returned. It had simply shifted. He turned his head toward the hallway, listening for signs of movement. The house was quiet for now, but quiet no longer meant peace. It meant the next decision had not yet arrived. And when it did, it would demand another negotiation between protection and autonomy, between brotherhood and accountability. Daniel closed his eyes without finding rest, knowing that the story remained suspended between past violence and uncertain future, its resolution deferred by the weight of choices still unfolding. Morning arrived without softness, light cutting through the curtains with the same indifference it had shown on the day of the shooting. He rose before anyone else and stood in the kitchen, staring at the carved word in the table as though it might have changed overnight. It hadn't. The groove remained shallow but permanent, a physical memory that refused reinterpretation. The warehouse arrests triggered swift legal movement. The two men apprehended were not high-ranking figures, but they were connected enough to reveal the residual structure of the fractured network. Federal agents became involved formally, broadening the case beyond local jurisdiction. Daniel was contacted again, this time not as a reluctant witness, but as a central thread linking multiple events. "You understand," one of the agents said during a meeting in a windowless office, "that your brother's initial involvement made you a strategic target. Your later cooperation made you symbolic." Daniel felt the word settle uncomfortably. Symbolic meant visible. Visible meant replaceable. "So what happens now?" Daniel asked. The agent folded his hands calmly. "Now we dismantle what remains," he replied. But dismantling something often makes it lash out. At home, Elias sensed the shift in atmosphere immediately. The presence of federal involvement felt heavier, less flexible. "You see," he said quietly one evening, "it's bigger every time." Daniel did not argue. Expansion had been the pattern from the beginning. Their mother tried to maintain routine, cooking meals and attending counseling sessions with increased frequency. Yet Daniel noticed her hands trembling more often. especially when unexpected noises echoed outside. Fear had embedded itself in her nervous system, no longer situational but chronic. A week after the warehouse arrests, Daniel's phone rang with a restricted number. He stepped outside before answering. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, younger, less controlled. "You think you're cleaning something," the caller said. "You're only exposing yourself." Daniel did not respond immediately. "If you have something to say," he replied evenly, "say it clearly." The voice laughed softly. "Clarity isn't leverage," it answered. "Uncertainty is." The line went dead. Daniel forwarded the call data to the agents, but the trace yielded little. The pattern was consistent: intimidation without explicit crime. The strategy was psychological erosion rather than overt violence. Elias grew increasingly restless under the constant surveillance and scrutiny. One night, he confronted Daniel in the backyard, the air heavy with humidity and unspoken tension. "You trust them more than you trust me," Elias said abruptly. Daniel met his gaze steadily. "I trust systems to respond predictably," he said. "I don't trust people under pressure." Elias flinched slightly. "You mean me?" he said. "I mean anyone," Daniel replied, though the specificity hung between them. Elias stepped closer. "You still see me as the guy who pulled the trigger," he said. Daniel did not deny it. "Because you are," he answered quietly. "And I'm the guy who survived it." The statement did not carry accusation so much as acknowledgement, yet Elias absorbed it like a verdict. "So, no matter what I do now," he said, voice tight, "that's who I am to you." Daniel hesitated. "It's part of who you are," he said. "Just like, it's part of who I am." Elias exhaled sharply, frustration simmering. "You think you're being fair," he said. "But you're building a cage around me, with your memory." Daniel felt the sting in that. "Memory isn't a cage," he replied. "It's a boundary." The conversation ended without resolution, tension thick and unresolved. Daniel realized that accountability could feel indistinguishable from confinement to someone desperate to redefine himself. Meanwhile, the investigation escalated. Financial records uncovered evidence of continued operations under new names. A prosecutor informed Daniel that his testimony might be required again, this time in a federal court. The repetition felt exhausting, yet refusal would undermine the fragile progress achieved. One evening, Daniel returned home to find Elias packing a small bag. The sight jolted him. "What are you doing?" Daniel demanded. "I'm leaving for a few days," Elias said without looking up. Daniel's pulse quickened. "Where?" he asked. Elias zipped the bag slowly. "Somewhere they won't look for you," he replied. Daniel stepped forward, blocking his path. "Running doesn't reset the board," he said. Elias's eyes flashed. "Staying doesn't either," he countered. "You think isolating yourself protects us," Daniel said. "It isolates you." Elias tightened his grip on the bag. "I was isolated long before prison," he said quietly. The honesty in that statement disarmed Daniel momentarily. He lowered his voice. "If you leave without coordination," he said, "you'll trigger suspicion on every side." Elias paused, conflict visible across his face. "Then, what do you want me to do?" he asked, exhaustion overtaking defiance. "Stay," Daniel said simply, "and choose restraint again." Elias studied him for a long moment before setting the bag down reluctantly. Days later, Daniel was summoned to provide testimony before a federal grand jury. The process was more formal, less public, yet equally consequential. He described the initial coercion attempt, the carved word, the vandalism, the warehouse meeting. Each retelling felt like reopening a wound that had barely scabbed over. After the session, one of the agents pulled him aside. "There's chatter about retaliation not against you," the agent said carefully, "but against someone perceived as your leverage." Daniel's stomach tightened. "Meaning?" he asked. "Meaning your mother," the agent replied. Daniel felt the world narrow abruptly. "What are you doing about it?" he demanded, his composure fracturing. The agent assured him that protective measures were being increased, but the assurance felt insufficient. At home, Daniel did not immediately disclose the threat. Instead, he observed his mother more closely, noticing how unaware she remained of the latest development. That innocence felt fragile and unjust. Elias sensed something was wrong immediately. "What happened?" he pressed when Daniel returned. Daniel hesitated, then told him. Elias's reaction was immediate and explosive. "I told you," he said, pacing. "I told you they'd shift it." Daniel's voice was low but firm. "And if I hadn't cooperated?" he asked. Elias stopped pacing, anger giving way to fear. "They'd still be outside," Daniel continued, "but we'd have no leverage." Elias ran a hand through his hair, agitation radiating from him. "Maybe leverage isn't worth the cost," he muttered. Daniel stepped closer. You think protecting her means withdrawing? He asked. Elias met his gaze. I think protecting her means not provoking, he replied. The argument circled without resolution. That night, security was increased visibly. Cameras were upgraded, patrols intensified. The house began to feel less like a home and more like a monitored zone. A week later, the federal arrests began in earnest. Several mid-level operatives were taken into custody, disrupting the reorganized structure. News outlets briefly revived coverage of the network, framing the developments as a triumph of persistent investigation. Yet triumph felt hollow inside the house. The tension had not dissipated. It had merely shifted from uncertainty to anticipation of backlash. One afternoon, as Daniel and Elias worked together repairing a section of fencing in the backyard, a black SUV slowed noticeably along the street before continuing. Elias stiffened. You saw that, he said. Daniel nodded. Document it, he replied calmly. You're too calm, Elias snapped suddenly. It's like you're waiting for something worse. Daniel set down the tool in his hand. Because something worse usually follows escalation, he said evenly. Elias shook his head in frustration. You talk like this is a strategy game, he said. But it's our lives. Daniel met his gaze. Strategy is how you survive when someone else is playing with your life, he replied. The exchange hung between them, neither fully right nor fully wrong. Survival had become layered, physical, legal, psychological. Each layer required different forms of vigilance. That night, the unthinkable happened in a quieter form. The power to the house cut abruptly, plunging everything into darkness. Daniel moved instinctively, guiding his mother toward the interior hallway. Elias grabbed a flashlight, scanning through the windows. Outside, faint movement was visible near the electrical box. Daniel called the emergency line immediately, voice controlled despite the adrenaline surging through him. Within minutes, patrol cars arrived, lights flashing against the darkened house. The disturbance proved minor tampering without significant damage, but the message was unmistakable. Someone was testing proximity. After the officers left, silence returned heavy and oppressive. Elias leaned against the wall, breathing unevenly. This is my fault, he said, the words forced through clenched teeth. Daniel approached him slowly. It started with you, he acknowledged. But it didn't stay there. Elias looked up, eyes red with restrained emotion. You could still walk away, he said. Stop cooperating. Let it fade. Daniel considered the proposition honestly. Walking away would reduce visibility, perhaps ease pressure gradually, but it would also leave the system partially intact, allowing others to be drawn into the same cycle. If we fade, he said quietly, someone else becomes the next leverage. Elias closed his eyes, absorbing the implication. You're willing to risk us for strangers, he said. Daniel's voice softened. I'm trying to prevent someone else from becoming us, he replied. The honesty in that statement settled between them, heavy but sincere. Elias did not argue further. Weeks later, the final phase of the federal case culminated in coordinated arrests that significantly weakened the remaining network. Sentences were handed down swiftly for those apprehended at the warehouse and in subsequent operations. Publicly, the matter appeared resolved. Privately, however, the psychological residue remained. Daniel found himself waking at night less frequently, though never entirely free of vigilance. Elias continued working at the warehouse, gradually earning a measure of quiet respect through consistent effort. Their mother's hands trembled less during meals, though the carved word remained a focal point she avoided touching. One evening, as they sat together at the table, Elias spoke unexpectedly. I don't know who I am without the fear, he admitted. Daniel looked up slowly. Fear shaped you, he said. But it doesn't have to define you. Elias nodded faintly. And you? He asked. Who are you without control? Daniel hesitated. The question pierced deeper than Elias likely intended. I don't know yet, Daniel admitted. The conversation did not end with resolution. It opened a quieter, more complex uncertainty. The external threats had diminished significantly, but internal recalibration had only begun. As Daniel cleared the dishes that night, he ran his fingers lightly over the carved word one final time. The groove felt less jagged now, worn slightly by repeated contact. Balance had not returned in the way their adversaries intended, but a different kind of equilibrium was emerging, fragile, incomplete, and dependent on continued restraint. He turned off the lights and stood for a moment in the dim hallway, listening not for danger, but for breathing the steady rhythm of his mother asleep. The uneven but present cadence of Elias in the adjacent room. Survival had not restored what was lost. It had transformed it. And though the immediate storm had passed, Daniel understood that the true reckoning was not with external enemies, but with the roles they had assumed within their own fractured family. The gunshot would always exist as a dividing line in their history. What came after would be measured not by the absence of threat, but by the choices made when threat no longer dictated every move. He walked back to his room, aware that peace was not something declared, but something practiced daily, and that even now, beneath the quiet, the weight of past decisions lingered, shaping every step forward.